Title: The Secrets of Blackwater Pond. Chapter 1: The Road to Blackwater. The air hung thick enough to taste, with a stagnant dampness that weighed heavily on my chest. It had been raining for hours, and the thick mist that rolled from the darkened forest had begun to swallow the road. I kept my headlights low, afraid to bring too much attention to the path that stretched endlessly ahead. I wasn't sure why I was still driving. Something inside of me urged me to turn around, but something else, something darker, told me to press on. There was a place that had been on my mind for weeks, a place I'd heard of only in whispers and hushed conversations. Blackwater. A small town on the map, its name marked by only a few faded roads, and the occasional, almost impossible to read notation about a pond deep within the surrounding woods. A pond that wasn't supposed to exist. Or at least that was what I had gathered from the fragmented stories told by the locals. When I first heard about it, I thought they were exaggerating. People always talk, right? Towns full of old stories, mysterious disappearances, the usual haunted house or cursed bridge. But there was something about Blackwater that was different, something that clung to the air like smoke, that made my curiosity grow into something akin to obsession. I had heard of the stories when I was younger, when the town of Blackwater was a distant place, only mentioned in passing by older generations, the ones who said they had lived nearby but never mentioned the place with any enthusiasm. They only spoke of the road, the one that wound through the forest and disappeared beneath the gnarled trees. Every so often, I would catch a mention of a dark history, but no one would say more, as if they were afraid to talk about it. Now, here I was, driving the same road that had been so casually mentioned in those hushed voices. I never meant to go this far, but somehow, the closer I got, the more the idea of it gripped me. The whispers of Blackwater, the stories, they no longer felt like myths or tall tales. They felt like a promise, a warning. The rain seemed to ease as I reached the edge of the forest, though the trees around me only grew more oppressive. Their branches stretched outward like fingers, trying to touch the sky, their shadows swallowing the last remnants of daylight. I slowed the car as the road ahead began to narrow, the asphalt giving way to rough dirt and gravel. The fog, thick and suffocating, curled along the sides of the road like serpents, crawling over the car's hood. I thought of turning back, of going back to my small town, where the air didn't feel so heavy, but the thought was fleeting. There was something in my chest now, a thrum like the pulse of the earth itself, urging me forward. It wasn't curiosity anymore. It was a need. I didn't see the sign at first, but it appeared before me like a spectral warning. Blackwater. Its letters were worn, the paint peeling, as though it had been there for centuries. I barely had time to register it before I was passing it, the sign vanishing behind me as quickly as it had come. There was no turning back now. As I continued down the path, the trees grew even denser, casting dark, shifting shadows over the narrow stretch of road. The further I went, the more the silence pressed in. Not the natural quiet of the woods, but an unnatural kind of stillness, almost like something had frozen in time. The deeper I went, the more the air felt thick, cloying, pressing against me from every side. I could hear the hum of my tires on the gravel, but it was muffled, almost as though the world around me was muffling all sound. I was almost halfway to my destination when the first signs appeared. Flickers of movement just beyond the edge of the road, a flash of something pale, an image so fleeting that I couldn't even be sure of what I saw. It didn't make sense. The woods were devoid of any visible life. There were no animals, no birds, nothing, just the shifting trees and that damned fog. But there had been something there, something watching from the shadows. I pushed the thought away. It had to be my imagination playing tricks on me. The mind can only endure so much isolation before it starts to create things, to twist reality. I shook my head and focused on the road, trying to keep my hands steady on the wheel. But then the air shifted. There was something I couldn't explain, something different in the air now. It wasn't just the fog or the trees. There was a presence, something ancient and patient, something that had been waiting for me. The road began to curve as I descended into a valley of sorts. The trees pressed closer now, their branches reaching out like twisted hands, blocking the sky. It was then that I saw the first building, a lone, dilapidated structure just off the road, barely visible through the fog. I could make out the outline of what seemed like a house. It had the air of abandonment, but there was something else, something I couldn't explain. I pulled over, not because I needed to, but because I had to. The moment I saw that house, I knew I had to stop. I stepped out of the car and into the thick air, the fog now swirling around me like a living thing. The trees creaked in the distance, and the sound was unnervingly loud, almost as if the forest itself was alive and watching. I approached the house slowly. It looked old, older than anything I had ever seen. The wooden structure sagged, the windows boarded up, and the roof was overrun with vines and moss. It seemed as though no one had lived here for decades, but as I got closer, I noticed something odd. The door was slightly ajar. It wasn't open by much, but enough to allow a sliver of light to escape, the light flickering eerily in the heavy fog. I couldn't resist. I had to go inside. Pushing the door open, I stepped into the darkened room. The smell hit me first. A rancid, earthy scent, mixed with something sweet and rotting. The floors creaked beneath my feet as I stepped further inside. The house was barren, save for some old furniture covered in dust, cobwebs hanging from the ceiling, and the faint outline of something strange etched into the walls. As I moved deeper into the house, my flashlight flickering on and off, I began to feel something I hadn't before, a sense of being watched, an awareness creeping over my skin. Every step I took felt heavy, as though the house itself was pressing down on me. The walls were covered with symbols, strange markings that seemed to shift in the light. They were crude, almost ritualistic, but they were too familiar. I had seen them before. Where? I couldn't remember, but I felt an overwhelming compulsion to touch them. My fingers brushed against one of the symbols, and that's when the room seemed to shift. The air grew colder, the house groaning like something alive, and for the briefest moment, the floor beneath my feet seemed to tremble. I quickly stepped back, heart racing, but I wasn't alone. The shadows that had clung to the walls now moved, stretching out like tendrils, coiling around me. The whispers returned, soft at first, but growing louder, louder until they were all I could hear. Words, phrases, all unintelligible, except for one. It's already too late. The realization hit me like a wave. The house, the pond, it wasn't just a place. It was a prison, and I had walked straight into it. The door slammed shut behind me, and I was plunged into darkness. Chapter 1. The Road to Blackwater. Part 2. I froze. The darkness around me deepened like a suffocating fog, pressing against my chest, my breath ragged in the still air. My heart pounded louder than the ominous silence, like a drum in my ears. The door had slammed shut with a force that rattled my bones. Though I had never seen it move, it was as though the house itself had closed me in, trapping me in its grasp. I took a step backward, instinctively reaching for the door handle, but it didn't budge. My fingers scraped over the cold, weathered wood, and it felt strangely wrong, as if something alive were breathing beneath the surface. I jerked my hand back, a shiver running up my spine, my pulse quickening with panic. The whispers returned, but this time they weren't just around me. They were inside me, clawing at the edges of my mind. Faint at first, like murmurs from a distant crowd, they grew louder, sharper, until they were all I could hear. They sounded like voices, overlapping one another, but they weren't human. No, not quite. The voices carried with them a sense of urgency, but more than that, they carried a warning. Leave. Leave now. It's too late. Too late. Too late. I could feel the air thickening, as though the house itself was alive and breathing with me. I looked around, the dim light of my flashlight flickering erratically, casting errant shadows across the walls. The room was vast, much larger than I had expected, stretching impossibly far beyond the confines of the small structure I had imagined from the outside. It seemed as though the walls themselves were expanding, warping, pulling at the fabric of reality. There were no windows, no means of escape, only darkness. I shook my head, trying to clear the growing sense of dread creeping over me. I couldn't understand it. This was just an old house, just a relic of the past, a place abandoned, forgotten. But the air was thick with something ancient, something old. It was watching me. I could feel it in every part of my being. The walls seemed to breathe. The floorboards creaked underfoot, but it wasn't the usual groaning of a neglected structure. No, this was something else. It was as if the house were alive, or waiting. The symbols etched into the walls caught my eye again, their twisted shapes shifting ever so slightly in the flickering light. They felt familiar. Too familiar. I couldn't place where I had seen them before, but a primal, deep-rooted fear surged within me when I looked at them. They were markings of an old ritual, a forgotten language of a people who had long since vanished. Something stirred behind me. I spun around, heart racing, but saw nothing. The whispers grew louder, drowning out everything. But then, amidst the cacophony of voices, a single word rose above them all, clear and cold. Help! The sound of that word froze me to my core. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't a cry for rescue. No, it was something darker, something more sinister. It came from the corner of the room, from the shadows that lurked there. I turned toward it, dread clawing at my insides. The shadows were moving, shifting, as if something or someone was standing just out of reach. I couldn't make out a form, but I could feel the presence. It was there, pressing against me, watching me with intent. I backed away, every instinct screaming at me to flee, to get out, but my legs felt heavy. They felt like lead, unwilling to carry me. The whispering had stopped, leaving an oppressive silence that pressed against my ears. The air was thick with it, thick and heavy. A faint light flickered in the corner, coming from the shadows. It was so dim at first that I thought my eyes were deceiving me, but then the glow grew stronger, brighter, until I could see the outline of something moving. It was slow, deliberate, as if it was waiting for me to notice. It wasn't a person. I could see the shape clearly now. It was a mass of darkness, shifting and writhing, a form that was only partially visible, as if it were both there and not. The light seemed to bend around it, unable to illuminate its full shape. It was made of shadow. No, not shadow, but something worse. Something that was shadow. The air around it grew colder, and I could see my breath in front of me, sharp and visible. The thing did not move, but I could feel it. It was watching me, studying me, its presence crawling across my skin like 1,000 invisible hands. I wanted to scream, to run, but something held me in place. It was as though the very room had become a prison, the walls closing in around me with every passing second. Then, in the faint glow of that twisted light, I saw something worse. A face. It wasn't a face in the way you might expect. No eyes, no mouth, no nose. It was an impression, a face formed of shifting lines, like a nightmare unfolding before me. It was impossibly large, swallowing the space around it, stretching wider with each heartbeat. It hovered in the darkness, only inches away from me, yet never touching me. And then, with a voice that sent a chill so deep into my bones I could barely breathe, it spoke. You shouldn't have come here. The words didn't just come from the air. They came from everywhere. Inside my head, I could feel them reverberating through my skull, clawing at the inside of my mind. I tried to move. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. My legs were paralyzed, as if the very act of resisting had become impossible. The darkness around me thickened, pressing tighter, wrapping itself around me like chains. The face moved closer, and the suffocating weight of its presence seemed to make the room shrink further, pushing in on me. I felt something wet touch the back of my neck, and I recoiled, but there was nothing there, nothing visible. But I could feel it, a presence, like breath on my skin. The house groaned, its foundations creaking as if it were alive, stretching, reshaping itself. The floor trembled beneath my feet. It wasn't the building shaking. No. It was something deeper, something beneath the house. A thought broke through my fog of terror. The pond. It had to be the pond. This place, the house. It was tied to something far older, something that lived in the darkness, beneath the earth. I had to leave. I had to leave. I finally managed to break free from the trance, stumbling backward. I lunged for the door, fingers scrabbling at the handle, but it was no use. The door was still shut tight. No matter how hard I pulled, it wouldn't budge. The whispers came again. But this time, they were different. They were clearer, sharper. It's already too late. You can't leave. You've already taken it in. The walls seemed to pulse, the house throbbing with an awful energy, as if it were alive, feeding off my fear. I was trapped, but worse than that, I had become part of it. This place, this nightmare, wasn't just a house. It was a living thing, waiting, and it had found me. The face in the shadows stretched wide, and the last thing I saw before the darkness consumed me was its impossible grin. Chapter 2. Echoes Beneath. When I opened my eyes, I didn't remember closing them. I was still standing by the door, my hand pressed against its cold, unyielding surface. The world around me felt wrong, as if time itself had slowed to a crawl, each second stretching like an eternity. The room, the house, felt like it was alive, breathing with me, pulsing under my skin. And then, the silence. The kind of silence that fills your ears with a ringing that won't stop. The kind that sits heavy in your chest, dragging the air down, making it hard to breathe. I stepped back, away from the door, my legs unsteady beneath me. My heartbeat was deafening, a steady thrum in my skull. I tried to steady myself, but the room felt as if it were closing in. There were no windows, no way out. Only the oppressive, unnatural stillness. The walls were moving. I wasn't imagining it. The wooden planks that lined the walls flexed, expanding and contracting, like the breath of some great, unseen creature. The symbols that had seemed so distant, so abstract, now pressed closer to my consciousness, twisting and changing shape with every passing second. They were alive too. Alive in a way that shouldn't be possible. I tried to focus, tried to rationalize the horror that clung to the air like smoke. This couldn't be real. No house could breathe. No walls could shift. But then I remembered the face in the shadows. The impossible, twisted face with its wide, jagged grin. A chill crawled up my spine, and my mind screamed at me to leave. But there was no leaving. I turned around, feeling the walls close in on me with every step. Every part of me screamed to flee, to get out of this place. But the floor beneath me was thick with an unsettling stillness that refused to let me go. Then came the sound, a whisper, soft at first, like the rustling of dry leaves. But as I strained to listen, it grew louder, more insistent, until it was no longer a whisper but a chorus, murmuring from every corner, every crack. It came from beneath the floorboards, from within the walls, from deep within the house, as though it were woven into the very fabric of this place. "You shouldn't have come." The voice was a faint, echoing sigh, as though it had been trapped here for centuries, waiting for someone to listen. But as the words formed, they twisted into something darker, more desperate. "It knows you. It knows your name. You can never leave." I staggered back again, my breath shallow, the words reverberating through me. They weren't just words. They were memories, fears, images flashing through my mind in quick succession, faces I'd never seen, places I'd never been. It was as though the house had reached into my soul and pulled out the darkest corners of my past. "No," I whispered to myself, my voice shaking, almost unrecognizable. "This isn't real. This isn't—" The floor creaked beneath me again, but this time it wasn't the house shifting. This time it was something else. Something large. Something old. I turned toward the source of the noise, my heart skipping in my chest. From the shadows in the far corner of the room, something moved. It wasn't a person. It wasn't even a creature. It was something other. A shape, blacker than the night, and yet it absorbed the light around it, pulling it in like a void. As it moved, the air grew colder, and I could hear the sound of whispers, more of them, piling up on each other, growing louder, frantic, as though they were trying to warn me of something even worse. I took a step back, but the shape followed. It didn't move the way things should move. It glided, like a shadow passing over an object, But it was real. I could see the shape of it, feel its presence pushing against me, pressing me into the corner of the room. The whispers intensified, now a cacophony of pleading, desperate voices. Run! It's too late. You're already part of it. I couldn't breathe. My throat felt tight, as though something invisible was tightening around it. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. It was as if the house itself had wrapped its fingers around me, forcing me to stay. I tried to focus, to make sense of the shape before me. It was still, but its outline was constantly shifting. It was like trying to focus on smoke, something that would never hold still, never allow you to grasp it. The more I looked, the more distorted it became. And then, like a snap in the fabric of reality, it lunged forward. I couldn't tell if it was a movement or just a shift in my perception, but I felt it in my bones. An overwhelming rush of cold that numbed me to the core. The shape moved impossibly fast, and in that instant, the air around me turned to ice. I staggered back, finally able to move, and fell to the floor. My hands scraped against the cold wood, and I heard a faint, almost imperceptible sound from the darkness, a low, rumbling laugh. It wasn't a sound made by any living thing. It was deep, hollow, as though the sound came from somewhere beyond the physical world. I scrambled to my feet, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The whispers, the laughter, they were everywhere now, surrounding me, penetrating my mind, filling the empty spaces. The shape was no longer standing still. It was circling me, moving around the perimeter of the room, closing in. And then, in the midst of it all, I saw something I hadn't seen before. The walls were bleeding. At first it was faint, a trickle of dark, viscous fluid running down the sides of the room. But as I watched, the blood began to pool, darkening the floor. The symbols etched into the walls glowed faintly in the dim light, shifting as if they were alive. They seemed to pulse in time with the beat of my heart, each thrum echoing in my chest, growing louder, faster. I backed into the corner, my mind reeling. The blood spread like a stain, dark and unnatural, its presence suffocating. A sharp noise cut through the growing cacophony, the sound of the floorboards creaking again. But this time, it wasn't the house. No, this was different. Something was rising. Something was coming from beneath. I looked down at the blood pooling at my feet. It was moving, shifting, like something alive, writhing, reaching. I stepped back again, but there was nowhere to go. The walls were closing in. The darkness was taking shape. And then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, a voice, clear and sharp, cut through the madness. "You're too late." It was her voice. The woman, the one I had heard when I first entered the house. The one who had warned me. Her voice was different now. Faint, almost unrecognizable, but there was no mistaking it. "You've already made your choice." The blood at my feet surged forward, spilling out in great waves, engulfing the floor, creeping up my legs, pulling me into its grip. I tried to pull away, but it was as though the ground itself had become liquid, sucking me into its depths. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the shape in the corner, its form shifting and changing, the impossible grin widening. Chapter 3. Beneath the surface. I woke to silence, but it was a different kind of silence, suffocating, unnatural. It clung to the air, as though the house itself had taken a breath and held it, waiting for something to stir. But nothing did, not the wind, not the creaking of floorboards, not even the distant muffled hum of life outside, only an unnatural stillness, pressing against my skin, leaving me aware of each breath I took, each movement I made. The floor beneath me felt wrong, like I was standing on the edge of something vast and unknown, and yet the room was the same. Or was it? I looked around. The walls were still adorned with those strange symbols, faded and etched deep into the wood. They seemed to have changed subtly while I slept, not in any obvious way, but in a manner that left my stomach churning. The air had grown heavier, thicker, as if every symbol had taken root in the house, burrowing deep into the foundation. The wood groaned under their weight. I tried to shake the feeling, tried to ground myself, It's all in your head, I thought. But that didn't make the fear vanish. I stood, legs shaky, and took a step toward the door. But before I could reach for the handle, a cold draft swept across the room, carrying with it a whisper so faint, I almost convinced myself it was just the wind. Almost. You shouldn't have come. The words were barely audible, a rasping sound that felt like it was carved into my very bones. My breath hitched. My heart pounded. I turned toward the source of the whisper, but there was nothing but the empty room. For a moment, I considered leaving, just walking out and never looking back. But something stopped me, something deep inside, like a pull I couldn't resist. It wasn't curiosity, it was something darker, something predatory, something that wanted me to stay. I approached the door, slowly this time, but as my hand touched the handle, a loud crack split the air, followed by a violent shudder in the walls. My hand jerked away. I stared at the door, watching as it trembled in its frame. The symbols, the walls, everything seemed to be alive now. And that low hum, was it coming from the walls? No, it was coming from beneath me. I took a step back, my pulse quickening. I had to leave. I had to, but my feet wouldn't move. It felt as though the house had rooted me to the spot, paralyzed, and I could only watch as the darkness seemed to shift before me. Then I saw it, a movement, at first imperceptible, like something crawling just beneath the floor. I knelt down instinctively, my fingertips brushing the smooth surface of the floorboards, cold and unnatural. My breath caught in my throat when I felt it, the faintest of vibrations beneath my hand. It was there. Something was moving. I jerked back, my heart racing, but before I could process what had just happened, the ground beneath me seemed to give way, not physically, but mentally. The air around me thickened, and I felt it, something tugging at the edges of my mind, something clawing at my consciousness. The house felt like it was closing in, tightening around me like a vice. The symbols on the walls were no longer static. They swirled, twisted, reshaped themselves in the blink of an eye, flashing in patterns that were impossible to understand. They weren't just part of the house. They were part of me now. You've seen it. The voice, clearer this time, came from nowhere and everywhere at once. It was a cold, guttural whisper, too close to ignore, but too distant to grasp. It wrapped itself around my thoughts like a vine. I turned toward the window, desperate for any escape, but the world outside was not what it should be. It was shifting too, like a mirage, a painted illusion. The trees outside weren't still. They were moving. They were reaching. A scream caught in my throat. The trees had hands. I didn't move. I couldn't. It wasn't that I was too afraid to act. It was that something in the back of my mind, deep in the darkest corners of my thoughts, told me I wasn't meant to leave. The house had already claimed me. It had already taken root inside me, and I could feel it spreading, burrowing deeper into my soul, making me one with its twisted reality. I backed away from the window, my hands trembling as I reached for anything to steady myself. I gripped the edge of the table beside me, the cold wood biting into my skin. But then I felt it, a sharp pain, searing through my fingertips. I pulled my hand away, gasping in shock as I looked down. The table, no, the wood itself, had changed. Where my hand had touched, the surface was now etched with marks, symbols that hadn't been there before, symbols that mirrored those on the walls, symbols that now pulsed with a faint, sickly glow. I jerked back, heart hammering, panic clawing at my chest. But before I could run, before I could flee, the voice came again. Only this time, it was different. There's no escape. It wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a command, an inevitability. The voice surged through me, crawling under my skin, rattling my bones. And in the same instant, the house seemed to shift. The walls groaned, the ceiling buckled, and the floor beneath me trembled. Something was moving beneath the house. Something old, something powerful. I had to get out. I had to leave now. I turned toward the door, my hand reaching for the handle. But when I touched it, something stopped me. Something invisible, but undeniable. A force that wrapped around my wrist like iron chains. I yanked, pulling with every ounce of strength I had. but the door wouldn't budge. A low rumble filled the room, and then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it, something sliding from the shadows. At first, it was a shape, a shifting darkness, but it moved with unnatural speed, and before I could scream, it was upon me. It was an arm, a hand, long fingers, too many of them, twisting in ways they shouldn't. The skin was not skin but something else, something pale and slick. The fingers brushed against my face, cold and clammy, and I screamed, stumbling backward. But the hand didn't stop. It was in my hair, pulling me toward the darkness. The whispers in my mind grew louder, more insistent, drowning out everything else. My vision blurred, my thoughts scattered, and I realized, too late, that the house was no longer a place. It was a thing, a living thing, and it was hungry. Chapter 4. The Eyes That Watch. The room had not changed. Or maybe it had, but I couldn't tell. The air was still thick with that oppressive stillness, the kind that smothers your thoughts and makes your heartbeat sound deafening in your ears. I was no longer sure of anything, whether I was still awake, whether the house was real, or whether the things that stalked its halls were only figments of my imagination. But I knew one thing for certain. I was no longer alone. I had learned to hate that silence. Before, it had been an odd comfort, something I could escape into after the relentless noise of the world outside. But now it was suffocating, a presence in itself. It pressed in on me, making it harder to breathe. The house had become more than a building. It had become a predator, one that knew when I was awake, when I was afraid, when I was desperate for escape. And it enjoyed my suffering. The walls were closer now somehow. The ceiling felt lower, as if the house itself was shrinking around me, narrowing my world to this single room. I could hear faint noises, soft whispers that came from no discernible direction. They were too quiet to make sense of, but their presence was undeniable, an undercurrent beneath every breath I took. The longer I stayed, the more they seemed to grow, their words slithering into my mind. You can't leave. You'll never leave. Each whisper wrapped itself around my thoughts, tangling with the images of what had happened, of what had changed. The things I had seen in the house, were they real? Or was it all part of my mind unraveling, a nightmare refusing to release its grip? I couldn't say. I couldn't trust my mind anymore. A sudden creak echoed through the room, jarring me from my thoughts. It came from the corner, a soft, unsettling sound, like the bending of bone or the stretching of skin. I turned slowly, my gaze tracing the shadows. The corners of the room seemed to grow darker, more defined, as if the walls themselves were moving closer. And then I saw them, eyes. At first I thought they were an illusion, a trick of the dim light perhaps. But no, there they were, staring at me from the darkness. Dozens of them, dozens of cold, unblinking eyes. Some were large, others small, and they floated in the shadows, fixed on me with a gaze so intense it felt as though they could see straight through to my soul. They weren't human. They were something else, something older, darker. And they watched, silently, waiting. I stepped back, my legs shaking. My heart raced, pounding in my chest as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The eyes didn't blink. They didn't move. They simply stared, cold and knowing, as though they had always been there. The whispers grew louder. They are watching. They always watch. I turned in a frantic circle, my breath coming faster now. The eyes were everywhere. They were in the corners, on the ceiling, under the floor. There were so many of them, more than I could count, and they seemed to grow as the room seemed to shrink. The walls were no longer static. They pulsed with the rhythm of something alive, something that was breathing in time with me. Suddenly, one of the eyes moved. It wasn't a slow shift. It darted across the room with unnatural speed, and as it moved, I could feel a cold, clammy sensation crawling up my spine, as if something were brushing against the back of my neck. I didn't dare turn around to see what was behind me. I couldn't. I could only focus on the eyes, the way they moved, and the way they were now circling me, closing in. I stumbled backward, my hands shaking, my breath shallow and rapid. I needed to get out. I had to escape. I had to leave before it consumed me, before the eyes dragged me into the darkness that had already begun to whisper my name. But the door I had once believed was my way out, my salvation, was no longer where I had left it. I blinked, confused, and turned toward the spot where it had been. But the doorway was gone. In its place was only the wall, smooth and unyielding. It wasn't real. It wasn't real, but the whispers didn't stop. They were louder now, overlapping each other, voices tumbling over one another, like a crowd speaking in tongues. You are ours now. We are inside you. You can't run. I felt it then. The pressure. It began in my chest, a tightening sensation as if something were pressing against my ribs, forcing the air from my lungs. My head spun. I couldn't breathe. I was choking on the weight of the house, on the weight of the eyes, on the weight of something terrible that was coming for me, something ancient that had woken and was now closing in. I turned toward the far wall, hoping that the hallway beyond would lead to an escape, but when I reached it, I stopped dead. The hallway was not empty. There, standing in the shadows, was a figure, a silhouette, a person, or something that once was. My heart stopped in my chest. The figure didn't move. It didn't speak. But I knew. I knew it was waiting for me to cross that threshold, to walk toward it, to surrender to whatever fate awaited me on the other side. Come to us. The voice was different now, deeper, more familiar, a voice from my past, one I had never wanted to hear again. It was my mother's voice. Come to us, child. I stumbled backward, my mind racing. The figure stepped forward, slow and deliberate, and I saw her face. But it wasn't her face. It was a twisted, contorted version of it, a nightmare made flesh. Her eyes, those same eyes, watched me from where they should have been. But they were wrong. Her skin, once warm and living, was now cold, decayed. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. It was as though her very presence had been gutted, reduced to a hollow, shriveled thing that no longer held any memory of what it once was. And then it spoke again. It's too late. You're already ours. I felt the floor beneath me shift. It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't respond. The walls were closing in. The darkness was creeping forward, thick and tangible. And the whispers, the eyes, the figure, they were all part of it. They were part of the house. The figure reached out, its hands stretching unnaturally long. The air grew colder, the temperature plummeting. I could feel the chill on my skin, creeping inside me, turning me into a part of the house. I couldn't escape. There was nowhere to run. Come to us. Her hand touched my shoulder, cold and unyielding. And then everything went black. Chapter 4. The Eyes That Watch, Part 2. I woke to darkness. At first, I didn't realize I was awake. I was still trapped in that half-conscious place, where everything felt wrong but nothing was clear enough to grasp. My mind was a jumble of fragmented thoughts, and my body felt heavy, like it was submerged in some thick, invisible liquid. The darkness around me felt like a weight pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I struggled to sit up, but my limbs refused to cooperate. The air was thick, suffocating, but oddly cold, a coldness that crawled under my skin and made me shiver. As I blinked, trying to clear the fog from my vision, I realized something. The room had changed. The walls, once familiar, were now curved and warped, as though the house itself had shifted in the night. The floor beneath me seemed to pulse in a slow, rhythmic thrum, almost like a heartbeat, but too slow, too deliberate. The shadows in the room stretched and moved with unnatural fluidity, dancing in time with the pulsating air. They weren't just shadows, they were alive. They watched. The eyes, the countless eyes that had once stared at me from the corners of the room were now everywhere. They were embedded in the walls, peeking from under the floorboards, blinking slowly, as if they were waiting for something, waiting for me. A deep sense of dread settled into my gut, making my stomach twist with the weight of it. I wanted to scream, but the air had thickened too much for sound to escape my mouth. The silence here wasn't empty. It was full of whispers, full of breathing, full of things that didn't want to be seen. I pushed myself to my feet, legs unsteady, as if I were walking on unfamiliar terrain. My breath came in shallow gasps as I scanned the room, looking for any sign of escape. But the room stretched on, endless, like a maze without walls. I didn't know where to go. I didn't know if there was anywhere to go. The eyes watched. They never blinked, never looked away. But now they were no longer just passive observers. They were hungry. I could feel it, the weight of their gaze pressed against my skin, seeping into me, crawling beneath my flesh, whispering things I couldn't quite hear. But I knew they were there. They were trying to pull something out of me, something dark. Suddenly, a loud creak broke the silence, like the bending of wood under the pressure of something heavy. It was coming from the corner of the room. A shadow moved, slowly, like it was struggling to free itself from the weight of the house. And then I saw it, the figure. It wasn't human, not in the sense I had known. It was a silhouette, a distortion in the dark. Its shape was twisted, elongated, like a reflection in a broken mirror. The edges of its form rippled, shifting, changing. I could see faint flashes of a face, but it was gone the moment I focused on it. Eyes, endless eyes, appeared where there should have been nothing but air. The figure didn't step into the light. It emerged from the shadows, pulling itself from the dark as though the darkness was part of it. And then I heard it, a voice, low, raspy, familiar. "You should not have come." The words crawled into my ears, scraping against my mind like nails on glass. My heart skipped a beat, and the room seemed to shift again, the air growing heavier, as though something was closing in on me. I tried to move, to run, but my feet were frozen to the spot. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. The only thing I could do was watch as the figure inched closer, its form coming into sharper focus with each passing second. It reached out, its long fingers stretching toward me, the shadows moving like they had a mind of their own, pulling its hand through the air as though it were swimming through the dark. I could see its face now, or at least what remained of it. Skin pulled tight across bone, hollow eyes that reflected nothing but a void, a gaping emptiness. Its mouth, if you could even call it that, was a twisted seam of darkness, as though the space between its lips had been torn open by force. "You shouldn't have opened the door," it rasped, the words slithering into my mind like a cold, slippery snake. "Now it's too late. You are part of this place now. You belong to the house. You are as much a part of the darkness as the walls." I wanted to scream, but the sound was trapped inside me, pressing against my throat like an invisible hand. The figure loomed closer, its presence suffocating. The shadows were closing in around me, pressing against my skin, crawling into my lungs. With every breath, I felt something inside me slipping away, something precious, something real. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it was being drained, slowly, relentlessly. Something about this house was pulling me apart. It wasn't just my mind, it was my soul. I tried to reach out, my fingers trembling, desperate for something solid, something real. But there was nothing. No escape. The figure's lips stretched into a thin, grotesque smile, one that seemed to stretch too wide, splitting its face apart in a way that no human mouth could. The eyes, those endless, suffocating eyes, were everywhere now. They were inside me. They were all around me. They were watching. "No one escapes," it whispered, the words curling like smoke into my ears. "You're already here in this place, where nothing can reach you, not even yourself." The last thing I saw before the darkness took me was the figure's eyes, cold, unblinking, consuming. Chapter 5. The Unseen. The sun had not risen when I woke. I knew this because of the peculiar silence that filled the room. No birds, no distant hum of morning life outside. The air was heavy with a weight that pressed down on my chest, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting. I had been here for days, weeks. Time had started to lose all meaning. But the darkness that enveloped the house felt wrong, in a way I could never articulate. It wasn't just the absence of light, but a more profound emptiness that gnawed at the edges of my consciousness. It was as if something ancient, malevolent was watching me, waiting for me to crack, to break. I sat up in bed, the sheets tangled around my legs. My hands were clammy, the remnants of a nightmare clinging to the back of my mind, slipping away as soon as I tried to grasp it. But the terror of the dream lingered. Something about the eyes. Those eyes, always watching, always lurking just beyond the veil of darkness. I could hear the house creaking, soft, rhythmic noises that were almost comforting in their regularity, yet unsettling when taken in the context of my situation. The walls seemed to pulse, the floors groaned under some hidden weight, as though the structure itself was alive, breathing in sync with me. I rose slowly, feeling an odd detachment from my own movements, as if I were a marionette, my limbs responding mechanically, without real thought. The air grew colder, and I could almost hear the whispers again, soft, urgent, insistent. My eyes darted around the room, but there was nothing, not yet. The hallway was dark. The flickering light bulb at the end of it cast long, jagged shadows that moved of their own accord, stretching and contorting like living things. I took a hesitant step forward, my breath shallow, my heart hammering against my ribs as though it, too, wanted to escape this place. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. It wasn't a physical presence, nothing tangible, but the sensation was undeniable. The house seemed to bend around me, its halls shifting, doors that were once open now mysteriously closed, windows that should have been covered in dust now strangely clean, as if someone had been watching them, keeping them pristine just for me. I reached the kitchen, where the faint smell of stale bread and rust hung in the air. The room was bathed in a sickly green light from the refrigerator's failing bulb. There, sitting on the table, was an old photograph, a faded picture of a woman and child, their faces blurred by time, their eyes dark and endless. The same eyes I had seen in my nightmares, the same eyes I had felt staring at me through the walls. I reached out to touch the photograph, but my hand stopped inches away, a cold shiver running up my spine. It was as if someone, was holding me back. A soft whisper echoed through my mind. A name. Sophie. I jerked my hand back, the air growing even colder. Sophie. The name rang in my mind like a bell, but I didn't know who it was. Why was it so familiar? The whispers became louder. A chorus now, overlapping voices calling out in fragmented syllables. I turned quickly, but there was nothing behind me, just the empty kitchen, the cracked linoleum floor reflecting the pale light. But then, I heard it, a soft tapping, like fingernails on glass. I followed the sound to the window. My breath fogged up the glass as I peered outside, my pulse quickening. The garden outside was overgrown, the hedges twisted and blackened, like they were feeding off the darkness itself. The tap-tap-tap continued, and I found myself opening the window despite every instinct telling me not to. Outside, standing just at the edge of the yard, was a figure, a silhouette, so dark it almost blended into the shadows around it. It was human, but not. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, watching me with those same endless eyes. Help me! The words were faint, barely a whisper, but they sliced through me with the precision of a blade. I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were cemented to the floor as I stared back at the figure. The cold seeped deeper into my bones, and the air seemed to tighten around me. I wanted to scream, but no sound escaped. The house was pressing in, urging me to stay silent. The figure raised one hand, its long fingers reaching toward the window, and then slowly, it beckoned me. I didn't want to go, but the pull was stronger than any fear I had ever known. It was as though the figure knew something I didn't, something essential. It was an invitation to understand. But at what cost? The tapping resumed, louder now, more insistent. My hand reached for the window latch, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. The house seemed to hum with a strange energy, a frequency I couldn't tune into, but I could feel it thrumming beneath my skin, in my chest, in my skull. The whispers grew louder, coalescing into a single unified voice. Come, come with us. It was too much. The tension in my chest became unbearable, and I slammed the window shut, backing away quickly. I spun around, heart racing, looking for any sign of comfort, any trace of normalcy, but there was none. The walls seemed to close in around me, and I could feel the weight of the house pressing against my mind, against my thoughts. I had to get out. I stumbled toward the door, my vision blurring, breath ragged. But before I could reach the handle, I froze. The temperature in the room dropped again, and I felt the air shift. There, standing in the doorway, was a figure, no longer just a silhouette. It was human, or at least it had once been. The face was distorted, eyes too wide, too black, lips stretched into a grin that shouldn't have existed, that couldn't exist. It opened its mouth, and the sound that came from it was a low, wet rasp, like a broken, wet cough. "You can't leave." The whisper came from the figure in the doorway, but the words weren't spoken. They were in my head, wrapping around my thoughts, twisting them. I felt myself falter, my knees going weak as I realized what it meant. I had already left. Chapter 6. The Fractured Realm. The door had closed behind me with a finality that sent shivers down my spine. The last vestiges of the outside world had disappeared as the house enveloped me like a thick, suffocating fog. The floor creaked beneath my weight, the sounds of my footsteps distorted by the sheer emptiness of the house. I had been here too long, or not long enough. Time was no longer a steady river, but a chaotic, ever-shifting current. Every room I entered felt both familiar and alien, like stepping into the wrong memory. But something had changed since yesterday, since I had heard the whispers outside my window. Something had begun to shift, subtly at first, then with an overwhelming force that threatened to consume me. I had thought the figure outside the window was a figment of my imagination, a trick my mind had played to drive me mad, but I was wrong. The deeper I ventured into the house, the more I realized that the house itself was alive. It breathed, it moved, it whispered. It had been waiting for me. I could feel it in the walls, in the air, like a strange pulse that quickened whenever I approached. My senses were on edge. Every shadow seemed to watch me. Every reflection in the glass felt like a trap, a mirror to some other place. I wandered through the hallway, unable to remember which direction I had come from, where I was supposed to be going. The walls seemed to close in on me, narrowing with every step. My breath became shallow, labored, the air growing heavier by the second. The lights flickered, casting long, jagged shadows that danced in the corners of my eyes. Then I saw it. At the end of the hallway, a door, just a door, like all the others, but there was something different about it. It wasn't the size or the shape or even the weathered wood, but the subtle vibrations emanating from it, like an invisible current running through the floor and into my very bones. The door was humming, faintly, as though it were waiting. I took a step forward, my feet heavy, dragging as if something was pulling me back. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to escape, but the pull of the door was too strong. The humming grew louder, almost deafening, reverberating through my skull. I reached for the handle, and the moment my fingers brushed against it, the hum ceased. The silence was oppressive. I hesitated, but only for a moment. With trembling hands, I pushed the door open. Beyond it lay a room that should not have been there. The walls were covered in strange symbols, etched into the very wood, twisting and writhing like they were alive. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the floor was slick with something dark and viscous that seemed to crawl with the pulse of its own beat. The room was dimly lit by a single flickering candle in the far corner, casting distorted shadows across the floor. And there, standing in the center of the room, was a figure. It was not human, nor was it entirely something else. It was something that hovered just between, its form rippling and shifting like smoke, like a creature made of nothing more than darkness and void. Its eyes, though, were unmistakable. They were the same eyes I had seen outside the window, the same eyes that had followed me through the house. It knows me. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. This was no longer some accident, no trick of the mind. This presence, this thing, it had been waiting for me. It had been drawing me in, piece by piece, until I was trapped within its grasp. I stepped forward, almost against my will. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, but I felt its gaze burn into me, a force so intense that it seemed to reach through my skin, deep into the marrow of my bones. My heartbeat quickened, and I could hear the blood rushing in my ears, drowning out all other sound. I was aware of nothing but the eyes, nothing but the pull. The floor beneath me groaned, the house seemingly responding to its presence, and I felt a deep primal fear rise in my chest. I tried to speak, to ask what it wanted, but my voice caught in my throat. I opened my mouth, but no sound came out, and then it spoke. Its voice was not a voice at all, but a sensation, a rush of cold that cut through the air, a deep, bone-chilling pressure that pressed against my thoughts. You are here, and yet you are not. The words filled my head, louder than the pounding in my ears, louder than anything I had ever heard before. It wasn't just a voice, it was an intrusion, an invasion, something that breached the very walls of my mind. You are a part of this. You always have been. You are the last piece. The words echoed through me, rattling my very soul. I felt my knees weaken, my legs giving way as the room around me spun. I reached out for support, but my hands met only cold air. The walls seemed to pulse and ripple, the symbols on the walls now writhing as if alive, expanding and contracting with each breath I took. The floor beneath me gave way. The part 2, the depths of the house. I fell. It wasn't a long fall, but the impact was enough to jar my body, to shake loose whatever grip I had left on reality. I hit the ground with a dull thud, and for a moment I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The air in this new place was thick with something foul and wet. The floor beneath me was cold stone, smooth and unyielding, slick with moisture. I could smell the earth, the dampness of the underground, but also something worse, something ancient. I pushed myself to my feet, my legs shaking. The room was impossibly dark, but I could feel the weight of something pressing in from all sides, a force that tugged at the edges of my mind. The silence was deafening, yet I could feel it. The presence was here, watching me, waiting. I turned slowly, my heart hammering, trying to make sense of my surroundings. There was nothing but the stone walls, slick with mold and age. A faint light flickered in the distance, the soft glow of something that didn't belong in this forsaken place. I walked toward it. Every step felt heavier than the last, as though the ground beneath me was trying to pull me back, to sink me into the depths. The light grew brighter, clearer as I neared it. And then, in the center of the room, I saw it. A mirror, tall, imposing, and framed in iron. The surface was smooth, untouched by time, reflecting the dim light like it was the source. It stood there, a monument in the center of the room, and the moment I gazed into it, I felt the unmistakable tug in my chest. The reflection that stared back at me was not my own. Chapter 7. The Echo of Silence. The house had changed. It had always been eerie. Even in the days before I knew its darkest secrets, there was a weight to it, an oppressive, invisible force pressing down on every room. But now, there was something else. It was as if the house itself had come to life, slowly, insidiously wrapping its fingers around my mind, its breath growing closer with each passing day. I had spent the past several weeks in its grip, never truly leaving its cold embrace. I had tried to leave, tried to pack my things and walk out the door, but the air, thick with unseen energy, held me here. The more I tried to escape, the tighter it clenched its hold. I had come to understand that the house was no longer just a place of stone and wood. It was something else, a living entity, pulsating with a dark, malevolent force that had been buried deep within its foundations. And as its hold on me tightened, I began to hear things, voices, whispers that had been hidden beneath the hum of the house, now loud and clear in the stillness of the night. At first, I dismissed them. I had to. I couldn't afford to believe what I was hearing. But now, I wasn't sure if I could keep denying it. The whispers had become constant, They slithered through the hallways like shadows, creeping into every corner of the house. They spoke in low, guttural tones that I could never fully understand. Sometimes it felt like they were speaking directly to me, calling my name, urging me to listen, to step closer. And each time I tried to ignore them, they grew louder. It was as though they knew my every move, my every thought. They were always just behind me, breathing in my ear, mocking my every effort to escape. Part 1. The Hall of Mirrors. The mirrors had started to change. It began subtly, with small distortions in the reflection. At first, I thought I was simply seeing things, but as time went on, the changes became impossible to ignore. The reflections in the mirrors were no longer mine. They twisted and warped, distorting my image into something unrecognizable. Eyes that weren't mine stared back at me. Faces that I couldn't place stood behind me, watching. But it wasn't just the mirrors. The house itself began to shift in ways I couldn't explain. The walls seemed to close in, narrowing the hallways until it felt like I was walking through a maze of my own mind. I had become trapped in this living nightmare, a prisoner of its labyrinthine corridors. I had always been afraid of mirrors, but now it was different. Now, I was terrified to look into them. One evening, as I passed through the narrow hallway near the parlor, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in a large ornate mirror. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. The reflection wasn't mine. The figure in the mirror was tall, too tall. It was gaunt, its limbs unnaturally long, stretched beyond the limits of human proportions. Its face was wrong. Its eyes were hollow black pits, and its mouth was twisted into a grin that didn't belong to any living thing. I could feel its gaze on me, even though I knew it wasn't real. But it was. I reached out slowly, as if my body was moving of its own accord, and the moment my fingers brushed the glass, the figure in the mirror flinched, as if it was reacting to my touch. The grin twisted wider, more grotesque. And then, to my horror, its eyes, those black, soulless eyes, began to bleed. I jerked my hand back, my breath ragged, and the figure dissolved into the glass, leaving only my reflection once more. But it wasn't the same. The reflection was still warped, the corners of my mouth pulled into a smile I hadn't made. The whispers grew louder. Vart. Part 2. The old attic. I had been avoiding the attic for weeks. The door to it stood at the far end of the hallway, closed and locked. But lately, I felt a strange pull toward it, a force that I couldn't ignore. It was as if the house itself was urging me to open that door, to descend into the darkness beyond it. I tried to ignore the feeling, but it was no use. Every day the compulsion grew stronger. It gnawed at the back of my mind like an itch I couldn't scratch. The more I resisted, the more the whispers filled my head, urging me toward the attic door. It was late one night when I finally gave in. I walked down the hallway, my hands trembling. The air grew colder the closer I got to the door, and my breath came out in visible puffs. I reached for the brass knob and turned it, wincing as the ancient wood creaked under my touch. The door opened with a low, mournful groan. The stairs creaked beneath my feet as I ascended, and with each step, the whispers grew louder, more frantic. They were now a chorus, a cacophony of voices all speaking at once, but I could make out none of their words. The attic was even colder than the rest of the house. A thick layer of dust covered the old furniture, the air heavy with neglect. The room seemed to pulse with a strange energy, as if something ancient and forgotten had taken root here. In the center of the room stood an old wooden chest, its surface darkened with age. It looked out of place, as if it had been waiting for me to find it. The whispers were now unbearable, drowning out everything else. I moved toward the chest, unable to stop myself. My fingers brushed against the worn wood, and I felt a jolt of electricity shoot up my arm. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that whatever was inside this chest was not meant for me to find. But I had no choice. I couldn't turn back now. I opened the chest. Inside, there was nothing but darkness, a thick, impenetrable shadow that seemed to swallow the light around it. I could feel something, though, something in that darkness, something waiting. I reached in, my hand trembling. Part 3. The curse unleashed. The moment my hand touched the darkness, everything changed. The room seemed to collapse in on itself. The walls twisted, the air thickened, and the ground beneath my feet began to tremble. I pulled my hand back in panic, but it was too late. The darkness had taken hold, pulling me deeper into its depths. I felt myself being drawn into the chest, my body becoming weightless, as if I was sinking into some unfathomable void. The whispers were deafening now, their voices twisted and distorted. They called my name, each one more frantic, more insistent than the last. They begged me to stay, to listen, to surrender. And then I heard it, a voice that was unlike the others. A voice that was low, guttural, and ancient. A voice that seemed to come from the very bowels of the earth itself. "You should have never come here," I screamed, but my voice was swallowed by the darkness. And then everything went silent. Chapter 8. The Heart of Darkness. And the silence in the attic stretched on for what seemed like an eternity. When I finally pulled myself from the chest, my heart pounding and my mind swirling with dread, I found myself standing in a different place altogether. The attic was gone. The dust-covered furniture, the oppressive air, the ancient chest. It was all replaced by an endless black void that seemed to stretch on infinitely. I couldn't see the walls, the ceiling, or the floor. I was simply suspended in nothingness, a place that defied reason and reality. The shadows were no longer confined to corners. They moved freely, writhing like serpents in the blackness. I could feel them watching me, their unseen eyes heavy with malice, their whispers threading through my thoughts. "You should never have opened it." The voice came again, low, menacing, and unmistakable. It was closer this time, as if the speaker stood right behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing. No figure, no shape, only the suffocating dark that pressed in from all sides. I tried to scream, but my voice was swallowed by the void, muffled as if trapped in a thick, invisible barrier. My breath came in ragged gasps, the cold air stealing the warmth from my chest, turning my skin to ice. The air smelled of decay, of something long dead. "It's too late now." The whisper came again, louder this time, an audible breath in the back of my skull. I wanted to move, to run, but my body felt as though it had been bound by invisible chains. Every muscle screamed with the effort to break free, but there was no movement, no escape. Suddenly, the void around me seemed to shift, stretching and warping. A faint light appeared in the distance, a pinprick of brightness in an ocean of darkness. It beckoned to me, a tempting promise of freedom, of release from the suffocating grip of the shadows. I had to go toward it. There was no other choice. I stumbled forward, each step an effort, as though the very air was holding me back. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't resist the pull of that light. As I drew closer, the shape of the light became clearer. It was a door, a wooden door, ancient and covered in dark, twisting symbols. The wood was warped, as though it had been subjected to centuries of abuse. A faint, otherworldly glow leaked from the cracks around its edges, casting strange, shifting shadows across the floor that seemed to move of their own accord. I reached for the door handle, my fingers trembling as they brushed against the cold, splintered wood. The moment my hand made contact, a jolt of pain shot through my arm, as if the door itself was alive, its presence rejecting me. I yanked my hand back, but it was too late. The door creaked open on its own. Part 1. The Unseen Eyes. On the other side of the door was something far worse than the darkness. Beyond the threshold, I found myself in what could only be described as a labyrinth, an endless maze of twisting hallways and rooms that seemed to stretch on forever. The walls were covered in strange symbols, carved into the stone like ancient warnings, and the air was thick with an oppressive sense of dread. The very ground beneath my feet seemed unstable, as though it was alive, shifting under my weight. I stood frozen, my heart racing as I took in the nightmarish surroundings. The hallways twisted and spiraled in ways that defied all logic, every angle and curve disorienting, as if the very architecture was designed to confuse, to trap. The light, if you could even call it that, was faint, flickering as though it was struggling to remain. But what stood out most was the feeling. There were eyes on me. I could feel them, lurking in the dark corners of the rooms, peering through the cracks in the walls. Eyes that saw everything, that knew everything. Eyes that watched my every movement, listened to every thought that crossed my mind. And though I could never see them, I knew they were there, watching, waiting. I tried to move, but the air seemed to press against me, urging me to stay still. The walls closed in, the oppressive weight of them threatening to suffocate me. The whispers returned, louder now, a cacophony of voices that clawed at the edges of my sanity. They spoke in languages I could not understand, their words like broken fragments of forgotten memories, fragments that echoed in my skull, making my head spin. "You shouldn't have come here." The voice came again, but this time, it was different. It wasn't just a whisper. It was a command, a warning that filled every corner of my mind. The words wrapped around me like a suffocating coil, tightening until I could hardly breathe. And then I saw it. At the end of the hallway, the air shimmered, rippling like heat off the pavement. Something was moving, something large and dark, something that shouldn't have been there. The shadows seemed to bend and twist around it, as if they were drawn to it, as if it was their master. It was watching me. Part 2. The Descent. I didn't have time to think. My legs moved of their own accord, propelling me down the hallway as the thing in the distance shifted, moving toward me. I could hear its footsteps now. A slow, deliberate rhythm, each step echoing in the emptiness. The sound sent a shiver down my spine, and I knew, deep in my bones, that it was coming for me. I turned a corner, hoping to escape, but the hallway stretched on forever, twisting in impossible angles. The thing was still behind me, its presence growing stronger, the air growing colder as it drew closer. I couldn't escape it. No matter how fast I ran, no matter how many turns I took, it was always there, just a few steps behind, its presence growing nearer. I was trapped. The walls began to close in on me, the narrow passageway shrinking with every step. The darkness pressed against me, the walls seeming to bend and shift as if they had minds of their own. I could hear the whispers again, louder this time, like 1,000 voices all calling my name at once. The sound was maddening, filling my head with a chorus of dissonant, unintelligible noise. And then, in the distance, I saw it, the light. It was small, distant, but it was there, a faint flicker in the vast expanse of darkness. It promised something, escape, freedom. I couldn't think. I couldn't stop. I had to get there. I had to reach the light. But as I ran toward it, the walls grew tighter, the air heavier. The whispers were no longer whispers. They were screams, raw and desperate, clawing at my mind, pushing me forward. I couldn't tell if I was running or stumbling, my body numb, my limbs aching. But I knew one thing for sure. I had to reach the light. And then, the ground gave way. Part 3. The Abyss. The world around me shattered. I fell, plummeting into an abyss of nothingness. I could feel myself spiraling, twisting through space, my body weightless and disoriented. The air was thick with the stench of decay, the silence deafening, broken only by the sound of my own breath. I tried to scream, but no sound came. The darkness enveloped me, wrapping around me like an unseen hand. I felt the cold of it, the emptiness that stretched on forever. There was nothing here. No light, no walls, no ground, only the endless void. And then, from the darkness, a figure emerged. It was tall, impossibly tall, its body twisted and contorted in ways that no human form should be. Its face was obscured by a mask, its eyes hollow and empty, its mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. It moved slowly, deliberately, as if savoring each step it took toward me. I tried to back away, but the darkness held me in place. It reached out with long, claw-like fingers, and as it touched me, the world around me dissolved, and I was gone. Chapter 8. The Heart of Darkness. Continued. I awoke, or at least I thought I did, in a place that should have been familiar, but felt like nothing I had ever known. The void, the labyrinth, the choking darkness. They were gone. The oppressive weight that had hung over me, that had made it impossible to breathe, had vanished. In its place, I found myself standing in a small, dimly lit room, its air thick with an unsettling stillness. The walls were made of cracked stone, ancient and weathered, but still intact. The floor was smooth and cold beneath my feet, covered in a thin layer of dust that hadn't been disturbed in years. It was too quiet. The silence seemed to hum in my ears, reverberating through my skull like a deep, resonant thrum. I was still disoriented from the fall, still shaken by the overwhelming sensation of being watched. Every movement felt wrong, as if my own body no longer belonged to me. And then, I heard it. A sound, soft at first, like a whisper, but it grew louder, clearer, until it filled the entire room. It was a voice, or perhaps many voices, layered one on top of the other, murmuring in a language I couldn't understand. The sound was both foreign and ancient, as if it had been spoken by beings that existed before time itself. I strained my ears to make out the words, but they were too jumbled, too dissonant to comprehend. It was as if the very air itself had taken on a life of its own, alive with the whispers of something far older and far darker than I could fathom. "You've crossed the threshold," one of the voices seemed to say. I turned toward the source of the sound, but there was no one there. The room was still empty, its stone walls cold and unyielding. And yet, I could feel their presence. The voices were all around me, unseen but palpable, like a shadow that clung to my skin. "There's no going back," another voice echoed, this one far more chilling than the last. I swallowed, trying to steady my racing heart. But the room felt like it was closing in on me, the walls inching forward with every passing second. My breath quickened, and I backed away, my eyes darting around the room, searching for any sign of an escape. The door. There had to be a door. I ran toward the far side of the room, where the shadows seemed to gather like an invisible weight pressing against the walls. But when I reached it, my hands grasped nothing but cold stone. The door wasn't there. "You can't leave," the voice whispered again, sending a chill down my spine. "Not now. Not after everything you've seen." I wanted to scream. I wanted to shatter the silence that pressed in around me, but no sound escaped my lips. My throat was dry, tight, and every attempt to cry out only deepened the silence. My body trembled with fear, with the knowledge that I had been caught, trapped, in something I could neither understand nor control. The voices grew louder, almost deafening now, their words no longer incomprehensible, but sharp and biting, laced with venom. "You opened the door," they hissed. "You allowed it to slip through the cracks. You let it in." I stumbled backward, my hands brushing against the cold stone as if it could offer some comfort. But there was no comfort to be found here. The air felt thick with something malevolent, something ancient. And then, as the voices reached their peak, the room, no, the world itself, seemed to ripple and bend around me. The walls blurred, stretching and twisting, until they were nothing but smears of darkness. The floor vanished beneath my feet, and I fell, was pulled into a void, an infinite chasm where the only thing that remained was the terrifying chorus of whispers. And then, I saw it. A figure. It was tall, impossibly tall, its form shrouded in black, its features hidden beneath layers of shadow. It stood at the edge of the void, watching me, its presence somehow colder than the darkness itself. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, glowed with an unnatural light, a sickly yellow that burned into my soul. I couldn't look away. I didn't want to look away. Its gaze bore down on me, as if it could see straight through me, as if it knew my every thought, every fear, every secret I had ever tried to bury. It was ancient, older than the world itself, and its very presence seemed to warp reality. "You are here for a reason," it spoke, its voice a low rumble that reverberated through my bones. "You sought the truth, and now you must pay the price." I wanted to speak, to ask what it wanted, what it meant, but the words died in my throat. Fear had locked my voice away. Fear had locked my body in place. The The figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. Each step seemed to make the void around it pulse, like ripples in a dark ocean. You think you are alone, but you are never alone here. The voice was everywhere now, seeping into my mind, filling the gaps in my thoughts. There are many like you, many who have come before you, all of them curious, all of them foolish. It reached out a hand, its fingers long and twisted, its nails blackened with age. As its hand drew closer, I felt the very air around me grow colder. My skin prickled with an unnatural chill, my heart hammering in my chest. I am the end of all things, it continued, its voice growing louder, echoing in the very marrow of my bones. I am the truth you sought, and the terror you now face. You cannot escape. The hand touched my forehead, and everything shattered. Chapter 9. The Fracture of Reality. Of the darkness clung to me like a second skin, suffocating in its intensity. I could feel the coldness seeping into my very bones, an unnatural chill that went deeper than just the physical. It was as if the void had become a part of me, twisting itself into the marrow of my existence. I had no idea how much time had passed, whether it was moments or hours. It felt like eternity. Everything around me had shattered when the figure touched me. The world had fractured into 1,000 pieces, each one jagged and sharp. My mind spun in dizzying spirals as I fell through the cracks, unable to hold on to anything, unable to understand where I was or even who I was. But then, the weight of silence pressed down on me, not the quiet of peace, but the hollow silence of emptiness, one that stretched far beyond the boundaries of reality itself. It was as though the very fabric of the world had unraveled, and I was now adrift in the void. I could hear nothing, see nothing, and yet I was painfully aware of everything. Was I dead? No, I couldn't be. My body still ached, still trembled with a cold that seemed to burn rather than freeze. I still had breath, still had the ability to think, if only in fractured, disjointed thoughts. But that was the cruel part. I couldn't escape the endless void, the pressing weight of silence, and the whispering presence that seemed to tug at the edges of my consciousness. It was coming back. The figure. It had touched me, and now its presence lingered. There was a subtle pull, like the quiet tug of a string tied around my heart, pulling me towards something. Or maybe I was simply being dragged, my will and thoughts no longer my own. I couldn't tell the difference anymore. Suddenly the void split open. A flash of light. The world reassembled itself around me, but it was different now. It wasn't the room I had fallen into. It was something far worse. The stone walls were gone, replaced by jagged black rock that twisted upward like the spires of a decayed cathedral. The ground was cracked, uneven, as if the earth itself had been broken apart by some tremendous force. The sky was an unnatural shade of red, a deep, bruised hue that seemed to pulse with an eerie rhythm, like the heartbeat of the world itself. I could feel the pressure building in my chest, my breath shallow and rapid, my pulse pounding in my ears. The whispers were back, louder now, and they were no longer just voices. They were laughter, mocking, twisted, and full of malice. I wanted to scream, but the sound caught in my throat, a suffocating presence that choked off every attempt to vocalize my terror. In the distance, I saw it. The figure. It stood on a jagged outcropping of rock, its towering form shrouded in the darkness that seemed to emanate from the ground itself. Its eyes, those eyes, glowed with that sickly, unnatural yellow light. I could feel them burning into me, probing the depths of my soul, stripping away whatever was left of my sanity. "You've returned," it whispered, its voice like a dark wind that whispered through the cracks of the world. "Did you think you could escape so easily?" I tried to move, to run, but my body felt heavy, as if the very air was pressing down on me, keeping me in place. It was as though I were glued to the ground, unable to lift a finger, to escape its gaze. My mind screamed in panic, but my body betrayed me. "You cannot escape," it repeated, its voice now a growl, low and reverberating in my chest. "Not from me, not from what you have unleashed." I thought of the door I had seen earlier, when I first awoke in that stone room. Was it still there? Was it my only chance of escape? The thought spurred me into action, and with every ounce of will left in me, I forced myself to move, one step at a time, as if walking through thick mud. The figure's laughter echoed behind me, mocking every movement, every breath. The ground shifted beneath my feet, as if the world itself was alive, a breathing entity that could sense my every move. The landscape twisted and warped as I moved forward, and with every step, I could feel myself slipping deeper into something far darker than I had ever imagined. The earth seemed to tremble beneath me, shaking with some ancient rhythm, and I realized with horror that I wasn't just walking on solid ground anymore. I was walking on the body of something. The earth itself was alive. My foot hit a patch of soft ground, and suddenly I was pulled down. The earth opened up beneath me like the jaws of some giant beast, and I was falling. No, I was being dragged, sucked down into the depths, into the churning blackness that reached up to swallow me whole. The whispers grew louder, sharper, the voices now distorted and shrill, each one overlapping the other, creating a cacophony of terror that pierced through my mind like daggers. My hands clawed at the ground, but it was no use. The more I fought, the faster I fell. And then, in that moment of pure, unrelenting terror, I understood. This was it. This was the end. I had crossed a threshold that I couldn't return from. I had opened a door that should have remained closed. The figure, whatever it was, wasn't just a force of evil. It was the embodiment of the world's fracture, a manifestation of everything that had been broken and forgotten. And now it had me. It had all of us. The ground beneath me broke away completely, and I fell, not into the abyss, but into something worse. Something that defied logic, that defied the very laws of existence. I could feel my body being torn apart by the pressure, my senses overwhelmed by a sickening nausea, as if the very fabric of reality itself had come undone. And then, everything stopped. The laughter, the whispers, the broken world, all of it ceased in an instant. And I found myself standing once again, but this time, I wasn't alone. Before me stood a reflection, not of myself, but of someone, or something else. It was the same figure from before, but now it was closer, no longer distant, no longer untouchable. Its eyes, those ghastly yellow eyes, bore into mine, and for the first time, I saw something that wasn't darkness, something that shouldn't have been there, a smile, a twisted, impossible smile. "Welcome," it whispered. "You found your place." I tried to scream, but nothing came out. Chapter 9. The Fracture of Reality. Part 2. The air around me thickened, a dense, suffocating pressure that made every breath feel labored. I stood there, frozen, my mind a maelstrom of panic and disbelief. The figure in front of me, that twisted, malicious shape, continued to smile, a smile that stretched unnaturally wide, its edges curling back to reveal far too many teeth, sharp and glistening in the red-hued light that bathed the broken world around us. I wanted to move, to run, to tear myself away from this nightmare, but my legs were frozen in place, rooted to the jagged ground beneath me. The whispers, once distant, now filled the air. Voices, thousands of them, overlapping, blending into an incoherent symphony of anguish. They tugged at the edges of my sanity, pulling me apart, one thought at a time. "Welcome," the figure repeated, its voice like the crackling of dry leaves. "You found your place." The words were hollow, as if they meant something more, something beyond comprehension. My heart pounded in my chest, but even that felt distant, as if my body was becoming disconnected from itself. I wanted to scream, but no sound came. My mouth opened, but the words that should have filled it, pleas, questions, desperate cries, were swallowed by the oppressive silence that had descended over everything. The figure's eyes burned into mine, its gaze so intense that it felt like it was searing my very soul. "You think this is a dream, don't you?" it asked, its voice now taking on an almost sympathetic tone. "But it's not. You're here because you belong here, all of you, all of us. There is no escape, there is no salvation." I wanted to argue, to deny everything it said. I had to. This couldn't be real. It just couldn't. I was trapped in some sick hallucination, some twisted nightmare. But the more I fought it, the more I realized how real it felt. The pain in my chest, the suffocating air, the cold sweat beading on my skin. This was no illusion. This was reality. Or rather, a reality. A reality that was now beginning to warp and twist around me, reshaping itself into something even worse. The ground beneath me shifted, trembling with a strange energy. The broken landscape began to change once again. What had once been jagged rocks and broken earth was now filling with water. Dark, murky water that rose steadily, creeping up around my ankles. I tried to pull my feet out, but the more I struggled, the deeper I sank, as if the earth itself was pulling me down, refusing to let me go. "Don't fight it," the figure murmured, its voice now a soothing hum, as though it were trying to lull me into submission. "It will only make it worse. You belong here now, in this place. You've crossed the line. You can never go back." Terror surged through me as the water rose higher, cold and unnatural, lapping at my knees. The whispers became louder, more frantic, as if the voices in the air were desperate to warn me, to scream at me to run. But there was nowhere to run. This place was a trap, a prison made of nightmares. I looked around, trying to find any sign of hope, but the world, no, the thing surrounding me, was nothing but death and decay. The air was thick with the smell of rot, the ground slick with something that felt wrong to touch. I could see shapes moving in the water, shadows too large to be human, twisting and writhing just beneath the surface, waiting for me. A sound pierced the silence, a sound that didn't belong, one that chilled me to my core. The water, it wasn't just rising, it was alive. It moved, undulating like a living thing, the surface rippling in unnatural patterns. I watched in horror as something broke through the surface, something black and formless, stretching and twisting in ways that defied all logic. I couldn't look away. I had to understand. My mind was trying to make sense of what it saw, but it couldn't. It couldn't, because it wasn't meant to. Then, from the depths of that hellish water, a face emerged. It wasn't a human face, not in any sense of the word. It was distorted, twisted. Its features were a grotesque parody of a human visage, its eyes sunken and empty, its mouth hanging open in a silent scream. The creature, or whatever it was, moved closer, the water swirling around it like a vortex. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. But it was already too late. The creature lunged. Its hand, or what passed for one, shot out of the water with terrifying speed, grasping for me with claws that looked like shards of broken glass. I screamed. Not that it mattered. No sound escaped my mouth. My limbs were heavy, paralyzed with fear, and all I could do was watch as the thing's fingers closed in on me, its jagged nails digging into my skin. But then, just as I felt the cold touch of its fingers, the world around me shattered. The creature dissolved into the water, its form collapsing into nothingness, as if it had never existed at all. The world around me wavered, like a reflection rippling on the surface of a pond. The twisted sky flickered, like a faulty light bulb, and the jagged rocks melted away into smooth, featureless stone. The water, the creature, the whispers, all gone in an instant. I blinked, disoriented, my mind racing to understand what had just happened. The world around me was now eerily still, the silence heavy and oppressive. I was no longer standing in the flooded landscape. No, I was back in the room, the stone room, where this all had started. It was as if nothing had happened at all, but that couldn't be true. The moment I turned around, I saw it. The figure, it was there, standing in the doorway, its yellow eyes glowing in the darkness. "You don't get it, do you?" it said, its voice soft, almost gentle, like a parent speaking to a child. "You can't escape. You will be one of us. The line has already been crossed. And now—" Its eyes glowed brighter, burning with an intensity that felt as if they were boring through my very soul. "Now you are mine." I tried to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. My body refused to obey. I could feel the dark presence closing in, the weight of inevitability pressing down on me. And that was when I understood. This was never about escape. It was about consumption. The figure wasn't here to let me go. It was here to take me. Chapter 10. The Hollow Beyond. And the room, no, the entire world around me, felt like a graveyard. A mausoleum of forgotten souls where time had become an abstract concept. Each second that ticked by felt like an eternity. Each breath I took seemed to draw in the very darkness that surrounded me. The figure stood there, its eyes like burning coals, watching me with an unblinking, insidious gaze that cut into the depths of my mind. It didn't need to speak again. Its mere presence made it clear that I had no power here, no escape. And yet, part of me refused to believe it. Part of me still clung to the hope that there was something more beyond this, that there was a way out of this nightmare. I couldn't just accept it, not after everything I'd been through, but the weight of the air around me pressed down harder. The walls, if they could even be called that, were shifting, pulsing like the flesh of a living being. The surface of the stone rippled as though it were made of water, and the shadows in the corners of the room grew longer, twisting in unnatural ways. "Why fight it?" The figure spoke again, its voice now laced with mockery. "You belong here. You've always belonged here. The world you came from, it was never real. It was just a lie, a fleeting moment, an illusion designed to keep you docile. This is where you belong, in the darkness, in the emptiness, in the eternal hollow." It was as if the very air were alive, suffocating me with its oppressive force. I could feel my limbs grow weaker, my thoughts less coherent. The figure was right in one regard. It wasn't a matter of escaping anymore. I wasn't sure I could even remember the world I came from. The lines between reality and this realm had blurred so completely that I wondered if there had ever been a world outside of this. But still, there was that nagging resistance inside me, the sliver of a thought that screamed no, that I was more than this, that I was not just another soul to be consumed. The memory of what had brought me here was fading, but there was something deep within me that urged me to fight back, to defy this place, to defy it. I clenched my fists, summoning the last vestiges of my strength, but my body felt like lead. I couldn't move, I couldn't run. I was trapped, a prisoner in my own skin. The figure took a step closer, its presence overwhelming, its very essence suffusing the air around us. "You've been here before," it said, its voice now a soft whisper that seemed to seep into my bones. "Every soul is meant to return. Don't you see? This is your home, your true form, your eternal resting place." It reached forward, its fingers grazing the edge of my cheek, cold and sharp like the touch of death itself. I recoiled instinctively, but even as I did, I felt the pull of the figure's power, as if my very essence were being drawn into its grasp. The shadows twisted, swirling around it like a cloak of despair, suffocating all the light in the room. I tried to speak, but my throat was dry, choked with the weight of the darkness. I couldn't form the words. My mind was slipping, falling deeper into the abyss, where nothing mattered, and everything became one eternal blur. "You are nothing now," the figure continued, its voice a soft hiss in my ears. "A forgotten dream, a whisper lost in time. There is no escaping the void. You've crossed the threshold. You've crossed into the hollow beyond." Suddenly, the walls, the ground, the air itself seemed to pulse with an otherworldly rhythm, like the heartbeat of some ancient, unknowable entity. The figure's smile widened, revealing a row of sharp, jagged teeth. Teeth that seemed to belong to something far older, far darker than any living thing. Its form seemed to shimmer, its shape flickering in and out of focus, as though it were not quite human, not quite anything. I was drowning in its presence, sinking deeper into its pull, when something changed. A flash of light, a sharp, blinding white light, cut through the darkness. It was so sudden, so bright, that it seared my vision, leaving me momentarily disoriented. For a brief, fleeting moment, the world around me was normal again. I was standing in a hallway. It was quiet. The air was fresh. I could hear my own heartbeat, steady and real. But the figure was still there. It had never left. Its eyes followed me, unblinking, its smile still twisted in that mocking, pitiless grin. "You think this is an escape?" it whispered, its voice a low growl now. "This is only a momentary illusion, a brief respite before the inevitable." The light flickered again, and suddenly I was back in the room. The stone walls, the oppressive air, the suffocating shadows, all of it was back, closing in on me. My heart pounded in my chest and I gasped for breath. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't find my way out. The figure stepped closer. I could feel its power now, the weight of its existence pressing against my chest like a vice. It wasn't just trying to consume me physically. No, this was something far worse. It was trying to swallow my soul, to erase me from existence entirely. "You are mine," it repeated, its voice a chilling echo in my mind. "And there is nothing left to stop this." I felt myself slipping, my mind fragmenting, but I wasn't gone yet. Not completely. Someone, deep inside me, still fought. It was a whisper at first, barely audible, a memory, a promise, a distant thought of something better, the fleeting notion of hope. And with that tiny spark, something shifted. The air cracked, and for the briefest moment, I could hear a voice, one that wasn't mine, but somehow familiar. It was faint, but it was enough. I could hear it again, clearer, stronger. "You are not alone." I wasn't alone. I forced my eyes open, my body shuddering with the effort. The figure's form blurred for a moment, as though the very fabric of reality was struggling to keep it together. I could feel it. The figure was faltering. "No!" it screeched, its voice distorting, warping into something inhuman, something far more terrifying than before. "You cannot resist." But it was too late. The walls began to crumble, the darkness began to retreat, and for the first time, the figure seemed afraid. It recoiled, fading like smoke in the wind. "You can't." The figure's voice was a hiss, fading into nothingness as the world around me shattered like glass, revealing a new world, one that felt far more real, far more tangible than anything I had ever known. I took a breath, and for the first time, I felt like I could truly breathe. The hollow beyond had released its grip. I was free.